She undressed right in front of the man, and he could only stand there, staring blankly. When she was down to just her nightwear, the woman showed no hesitation, climbed onto the edge, turned around, and slipped into the fountain pool. After searching underwater for quite a while, she lifted out a shard of the broken vase, while the man waited nearby, visibly anxious. In the next moment, Cecilia rose from the water like a vision, and her striking beauty left Robbie frozen in place. Only after a long pause did he realize it was improper to stare at her body like that, and Robbie quickly turned away and closed his eyes. Cecilia also sensed the sudden awkward tension and hurriedly put her clothes back on. Then, clearly upset, Cecilia snatched another fragment from Robbie's hand. Watching the girl he loved storm off in anger, Robbie did not chase after her to apologize, but instead reached out, letting his skin feel the water she had just warmed with her body. However, this tender moment carried a completely different meaning in the eyes of Cecilia's younger sister. Cecilia was the daughter of a British upper-class family, while Robbie was the son of one of their servants. In order to repay the debts left behind by his father, who had fled, Robbie stayed at the estate, doing various jobs. Because it was Cecilia's father who paid for Robbie's education, Robbie not only felt obligated to repay the family, but also held deep gratitude toward them. And of course, his feelings for Cecilia played a role as well. Yet in front of everyone, Cecilia always appeared distant and indifferent toward Robbie, which led her sister Briony to believe that she herself had the right to like him.
If I fell in, would you save me?
Of course.
When Robbie jumped into the lake without hesitation, Briony believed that anyone who would risk himself to face danger for her must surely love her.
I wanted you to save me.
Don't you know how easily you could have drowned?
You saved me.
Stupid child! You could have killed us both! Is that your idea of a joke?
At this moment, Briony had no understanding at all of why Robbie was angry. To Robbie, this kind of extreme emotional proof was not just childish stubbornness, but something far more unsettling, a kind of fear rooted in Briony's deeply selfish inner world. So when she witnessed the ambiguous moment between her sister and Robbie, intense jealousy, resentment, and even thoughts of retaliation quietly began to take hold in her heart. At this time, Cecilia's brother Leon arrived home with his friend Paul. Paul was the owner of a chocolate factory, unquestionably a wealthy man. While strolling through the hallway, Paul noticed 3 children, all relatives of Cecilia, who were temporarily staying here because the war had made it impossible for them to return home. Paul appeared kind and approachable on the surface, but in reality, he was someone with deeply troubling intentions. Seeing that Lola seemed a bit mature for her age, Paul offered her a piece of chocolate as a gesture of friendliness. Meanwhile, Robbie was in his small room, writing a letter to Cecilia. After the fountain incident, his mind was filled with the image of Cecilia, her hair and clothes still damp. He typed out a letter full of heated emotion and suggestive language, and when he looked at the bold words on the page, even Robbie himself laughed shyly. After thinking it over for a long time, he then wrote a second letter by hand, this one completely proper. In the end, he put on a sharp suit and set out to deliver the letter to Cecilia, but Robbie made 2 critical mistakes. On the way, he ran into Briony, and because he felt too embarrassed to hand the letter to Cecilia himself, he asked Briony to pass it along to her sister. But faced with the well-dressed Robbie, Briony felt nothing but overwhelming jealousy. As he watched Briony run off, Robbie briefly imagined Cecilia's reaction, but soon realized something was terribly wrong, as he had rushed out in such a hurry that he had mixed up the letters, leaving the handwritten one behind and putting the explicit typed one in the envelope. To an adult, the words were simply overly direct, but in Briony's eyes, they were something shameful, furious. She handed the letter to Cecilia, and the moment Cecilia read it, she was thrown into panic, torn between excitement at Robbie's confession and fear that Briony might tell others about its contents. But with so many people in the room, and the letter being so sensitive, Cecilia had no choice but to refrain from addressing Briony on the spot. Briony, however, felt no guilt at all for prying into someone else's privacy, and even went on to tell her cousin Lola about it. Guided by Briony's words, Lola went along with it, saying that Robbie was nothing but a disgraceful man who should be handed over to the authorities. Just as the 2 girls were talking, Robbie rang the bell at the front gate, and the person who came out was none other than Cecilia. For Cecilia, a single letter was enough to reveal his feelings. The bold words were born of intense love, and the suggestive tone came from deep longing. Robbie had come to apologize for his lack of restraint, but after all these years, this was exactly what Cecilia had been waiting to hear, and whether it was a confession or a declaration of love, she would have accepted it wholeheartedly. In that moment, there were no barriers of class, no judgments from others, because every love story ultimately leads to closeness and comfort.
Cecilia,
I love you.
I love you.
What should have been an eruption of mutual passion was suddenly interrupted by Briony's intrusion, freezing all that beauty forever in that single instant. After straightening her clothes, Cecilia left the room without saying a word. Robbie wanted to say something after her, but after hesitating, he too chose silence. Left alone, Briony held back tears filled with jealousy, as her thoughts slowly began to twist. Later, the family gathered for dinner, and Robbie was invited to sit at the table as well. After the earlier embrace, what followed was an unspoken closeness beneath the table. Soon, Briony accidentally found a note, and when she brought it back, it startled Cecilia, who thought it was Robbie's letter, only to learn that it was actually a farewell message written by two young relatives. It was dangerous to run out so late at night, so everyone went out together to search, but Briony soon drifted away from the group and walked alone into the woods, holding a flashlight. Once again, she witnessed a similar scene. As the moment the flashlight fell to the ground, she saw a man in a suit fleeing from her sight. Coming back to her senses, Briony rushed over to check on Lola and asked who had hurt her, believing she was standing up for justice, never realizing that Lola's feelings were far more complicated than she imagined.
It was Robbie, wasn't it? Robbie? You saw him. Like you said, he's a sex maniac, and you don't even know what happened before dinner.
Hearing Briony say this, Lola looked shocked, but if it meant protecting that man and gaining sympathy for herself, she saw no reason to refuse. Just like that, the two boys had not yet been found, and Lola was carried back to her room. As the only witness, Briony firmly insisted that the person responsible was Robbie. To prove that she was telling the truth, she even went to her sister's room, found the letter, and handed it to their mother. At this point, Briony had no idea what consequences her lie would bring. Faced with the harm that was about to unfold, Cecilia was powerless, and all she could do was wait for Robbie to return. Each family member watched with different emotions as Robbie came back to the estate with the two missing boys. Robbie was relieved to have found the children, but Cecilia's face was filled with worry. Because of Briony's testimony, Robbie was taken away by the police before he could even step into the house.
I love you. Come back. Come back to me.
Watching the two of them part downstairs with such reluctance, Briony felt a sense of satisfaction in that moment, yet this would become the burden she carried for the rest of her life. 3.5 years later, Robbie was released, not because his sentence had ended, but because France had fallen in the war and Britain was sending troops to support its ally. Robbie was given a choice to serve his country, and as long as he survived and returned, he would be spared further imprisonment. During the years Robbie was incarcerated, Cecilia had already cut ties with her family, and she was the only one who firmly believed in his innocence. No matter where Robbie was or where he went, she was determined to wait for him to come back to her. Choking back emotion, Robbie did love her, but his heart ached for what Cecilia had sacrificed, and he felt that none of this was her fault, making him believe even more that he had ruined her life.
Robbie, didn't you read my letters? Had I been allowed to visit you, had they let me every day, I would have been there every day.
Yes, but if all we have rests on a few moments in a library 3.5 years ago, then I'm not sure.
Robbie, look.
I don't know if...
Look at me. Come back. Come back to me.
After hearing Cecilia's words, Robbie finally let go of the knot in his heart. Before seeing Cecilia off, she took a photograph out of her coat, leaving it with Robbie as a keepsake and as the place they both dreamed of. After a deep, lingering kiss, Cecilia boarded the bus back to the hospital, and as Robbie ran after it, watching her fade into the distance, it felt as though they were already separated by thousands of miles. Half a year later, Robbie set foot on French soil, on the ever-changing battlefield. Robbie and two wounded soldiers became the only survivors of their unit. Amid days filled with explosions and chaos, Robbie endured countless restless nights, and no matter how much destruction surrounded him, he held tightly to the belief that he would return home. After a long and exhausting journey, The three finally reached the beach where British forces were retreating, only to discover that more than 300,000 soldiers were waiting there with the same hope of going home. On the beaches of Dunkirk, despair hung in the air like a shadow of approaching death. Rescue ships had been destroyed, and crossing the English Channel back home seemed like an impossible dream for the British Army. Robbie did not care about any of that. He had endured prison and faced the battlefield, and now that a chance to go home finally existed, he found himself trapped on this stretch of sand. If they were ultimately surrounded there, then the 33 kilometers of the English Channel would become the shortest distance between Robbie and Cecilia. But the one who did not wish for such an ending was not only Robbie and Cecilia, but Briony as well. As she grew older, Briony came to realize that her actions had caused irreversible damage to Cecilia and Robbie, tearing the family apart, driving Cecilia away from home, and leaving Robbie stranded far from home with his fate uncertain amid the violence of war. In an attempt to atone for her guilt, Briony became a nurse like her sister Cecilia, hoping that one day she might care for a returning Robbie, not for any reward, but simply to say she was sorry for her past mistake. Surrounded by an endless flow of wounded soldiers, Briony forced herself to push through physical discomfort to help as much as she could, and the more she witnessed, the more deeply she understood the cruelty of war, and the heavier her sense of guilt became. Over the years, Briony kept writing letters to Cecilia, trying to seek her sister's forgiveness, but she never received a reply, until one day, Briony attended a wedding, and standing at the altar were none other than the wealthy Paul and her cousin Lola. The vows exchanged on stage felt like endless mockery to Briony, because she had clearly seen Paul's face on the grass that night, yet for her own selfish reasons, she had pushed Robbie into a fate he could never escape. Perhaps only she truly understood how hollow the phrase true love ends in union sounded when applied to this marriage. After the wedding, Briony gathered her courage and went to visit Cecilia. After all these years, seeing her again, Cecilia seemed unchanged. In response to Briony's apology, Cecilia stated plainly that she would not accept it, and had no intention of doing so. Briony was not surprised by this, but Robbie's appearance left her deeply shaken. Briony had imagined countless scenarios of facing Robbie again, and in every one of them, she believed she would have to accept whatever came her way. Yet her fearful heart had prepared for a scene of angry accusations, and in front of an imagined outburst from Robbie, the seemingly pitiful Briony would have no chance to speak. In her mind, the harsher his words, the closer she would be to redemption. But some mistakes can never be undone, and some wounds never truly heal. Many years later, an elderly Briony was interviewed as a celebrated writer, and her final work was titled Atonement. This story, drawn from her entire life, finally reached its conclusion. Yet in the interview, Briony admitted that the scene of seeking forgiveness at Cecilia's home existed only in her imagination. She did not want the two of them to continue playing tragic roles in her fictional world, so she softened the ending, because even she could not accept how the real story truly ended. On the night before the evacuation at Dunkirk, Robbie closed his eyes while thinking of Cecilia, and due to his injuries, he never boarded a ship home, leaving both his body and his love behind on that shore. Cecilia, who had been waiting at home for Robbie's return, encountered rising floodwaters caused by damaged pipes while sheltering from air raids in the underground, and in endless longing, she eventually stopped breathing.
So, my sister and Robbie were never able to have the time together they both so longed for and deserved, and which ever since
In the final pages of the novel, Robbie and Cecilia arrive at the beach of their dreams, where there is no war, no lies, and none of the troubles of the world. Yet no matter how beautiful the sea appears on the page, it holds no warmth, and no matter how joyful the smiles seem, they make no sound, because behind every softened ending in fiction lies a harsh truth in reality. But for two people who truly loved each other, having loved is enough. Even if I carried a crime I never deserved, I would still find the strength to return to you the moment I see you. And even if the entire world misunderstands you, I will believe in you, wait for you, and love you without hesitation.
I will return. Find you, love you, marry you, and live without shame.